At the end of every yoga class, my sister, who is also my awesome instructor, reads a thought-provoking quote or short passage. Recently, she read the following from an interview with Dar Jamal about his new book, The End of Ice. The single biggest thing I learned was from an indigenous elder of Cherokee descent, Stan Rushworth, who reminded me of the difference between a Western settler mindset of I have rights and an indigenous mindset of I have obligations. Instead of thinking that I am born with rights, I choose to think that I am born with obligations to serve past, present, and future generations and the planet herself. I was struck by the distinction Jamal made between rights and obligations, something I have not really thought much about. Though the author was principally referring to climate change, I realized that during this pandemic, we find ourselves in the midst of, I have heard an awful lot about rights, mostly justified by vague references to the First or Second Amendments to our Constitution, and not much about obligations. I have the right to not wear a mask, even though COVID has claimed nearly 200,000 American lives. I have the right to open my restaurant and space my tables any way I see fit, even if it puts my customers at risk. I have the right to hold a worship service in a poorly ventilated building this coming winter, even when doing so increases the likelihood that someone in the congregation will become infected. I have the right to jam thousands of people shoulder to shoulder in an airplane hangar or even an indoor venue and work them into a verbal frenzy if I think it will help me be reelected. All that being said, as COVID continues to rage or reignite, I have heard little about our obligations to one another, embodied in the preamble of that same Constitution, our obligation to promote the general welfare for the sole purpose of forming a more perfect union. Do we have an obligation to wear a mask because it protects those around us and because 50% of us don't know whether or not we are COVID carriers? Do we have an obligation to socially distance and insist that businesses mandate the same? Do we have an obligation to refrain from leading worship come winter when the windows and doors of the sanctuary must be closed and that good summer ventilation we depended upon is no more? Do we have an obligation to abide by the rules and regulations regarding large gatherings in the midst of what more and more seems like a never-ending health crisis? Rights, obligations, how do you balance them? Because they represent both sides of true liberty. In a functioning democracy, one cannot exist without the other. And what do you do when the craving for individual rights supersedes a commitment to our obligations to serve past, present, and future generations? That seems to be at the crux of where we find ourselves now here in the U.S., polarized once again. How do we restore that necessary balance between rights and obligations? In short, how do we change the cultural narrative? I wish I had an easy answer, or better yet, a magic wand. It's a tough narrative to change because it seems so deeply ingrained in the American psyche right now. However, I would ask you to reflect on that narrative and on how you as an individual might go about changing it. I'm thinking that maybe where we start is day in and day out, making a commitment to change our own personal narrative and praying that enough people will do so to get us beyond COVID and into a new normal that embraces both rights and obligations. Perhaps each day we need to ask ourselves, what are my obligations? To what do I devote my life this day? And if starting out each morning that way seems Pollyanna-ish to you, well, remember that we are called not only to ask the questions, what are my obligations, to what do I devote my life this day, but also to act upon our answers. And if that still seems small and inconsequential to you, I would say give it a try anyway. For as American cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.